Can I ask you a question, Matthew? Madge squinted at me through muddy brown eyes. She was sitting in her usual armchair by the window, wrinkled hands folded in her lap. She'd got my name wrong again, but I didn't bother correcting her. Through the weeks I've been visiting her, I've had Matthew, Tim, Fred, Bill, Bob, and Henry. It'll be enough for a football team soon. I'm used to it by now. Ignoring mistakes like that is one of the first things the nurse taught me. Said it only confuses them if you keep picking them up on the little things. Of course, Madge, I said now, smiling at her. What did you want to ask me? If you were old, she said slowly, old like me, what would you want to do? What would I want to do about what? At the end, love. Would you want one last big blowout, or would you just fade away in peace? I stared at Madge, trying to hide my confusion. I had the urge to glance around the nursing home for help, but I resisted. I don't know much about the old lady, but I do know this. She has dementia. Has it bad, apparently. That was the first thing they told me when I started volunteering. They warned me she'd likely say a lot of things that confused me, things that didn't make any sense, and they were right about that. I've gotten used to it by now, but Madge's question caught me off guard. I think it was because it was the first time I'd heard her sound close to normal. The ghost of the person she once was. She'd asked me something, I'd responded, and then she'd follow it up with another question. Usually all I get from her is comments about the weather, and random stories I assume are from her past. Nothing like this. I opened my mouth to say something back to Madge, then paused, made myself stop and think. Usually I had no problem making small talk with her, but now I felt a wave of self-doubt drift through my mind. The truth is, I'm no expert when it comes to the elderly, especially not elderly people with dementia. A long way from it. And despite the image I try to give off to the residents who live at Eldritch Nursing Home, I'm not actually here out of goodness of my heart either. I should come clean. The truth is, helping out at the home is killing two birds with one stone for me. The volunteering counts towards my Duke of Edinburgh award, which will apparently help me when I come to apply for uni next year. That's one thing. The other is way more interesting though, and that's the fact that Eldritch Nursing Home is haunted. Or at least it's meant to be haunted. That's what the rumours say. The place is practically legend in our town. Ever since I was a little kid, I've heard stories about it. Some say there are ghosts living in the attic that come down and possess the residents at night. Others say the building is haunted by a witch called Old Wendy. I've even heard one story, my personal favourite, that claims a secret child murdering cult is based here. A shadowy organisation that makes kids disappear. The stories are all ridiculous, of course. I know that. I'm not completely gullible. But I will admit, I've always had a weird fascination with ghosts and urban legends. I've always been drawn to them. So, when I heard that one of my modules this year would be on local history, I thought Eldritch Nursing Home would be the perfect case study. The only problem? The image I had in my head hasn't quite lived up to the reality. Sure, Eldritch looks eerie enough on the outside. It's this huge, towering brick building on the edge of town that could be straight out of a horror film. But, as I discovered on my first day, the inside is actually quite dull. It's clean and modern, and there are staff in bluey-green uniforms fleeting about all over the place. It's more like a hospital than a haunted house. And instead of exploring dimly lit corridors and interviewing creepy old blokes about their encounters with the paranormal, I've been stuck sitting with Madge. 90% of the time she's silent, and the other 10% of the time she spouts gibberish. Only now, she wasn't speaking gibberish. Would you want one last blowout, or would you just fade away in peace? I ran the question through my mind. Where the hell had it come from? Sure, Madge had asked me occasional questions before, but it was usually just stuff about my day or whether I'd put the kettle on. Questions she'd often repeat several times over the course of the hour I sat with her. She'd never asked me anything like this before. I suddenly became aware that Madge was still looking at me, watching me through her muddy eyes. Those eyes normally twitch back and forth in their sockets as though they were looking for something she could never quite find. So, having them fixed on my face was a little unsettling. Then I realized she was probably waiting for me to respond to what she'd said. I'd spent the last 30 seconds daydreaming, and I'd completely forgotten to answer her. Would I want to have a big blowout? That's right, love. Would you want one last time, or would you prefer to go out peaceful? I shuffled in my seat and frowned. I still didn't really know what Madge was on about, but I figured I'd take some advice a nurse called Brenda had given me on my first day. Sometimes it's better just to play along. Well, I suppose that depends, Madge, I said now. It depends on what's going to make you happy. I don't really know where those words came from, but they sounded right as I said them, and Madge seemed pleased with my answer too. She actually nodded her head, still fixing me with those brown eyes. Then her smile faded. Can I ask you one more question, Sam? I felt a tiny chill go through me. Sam. She'd gotten my name right. For the very first time in the 2 months I'd been visiting her, she'd actually said my name. I nodded my head. Sure, Madge. What do you want to ask me? She leaned forward slightly in her chair, kept her eyes locked on mine. After a moment, her thin lips parted to reveal a mouthful of chipped brown teeth. Are you a good boy, Sam? She spoke the word softly, her eyes never leaving my face. Have you been a good young man? I felt another faint chill go down my back. Madge's lips were still parted, and I had to force myself not to stare at her teeth. I had to resist the urge to look at the watch on my wrist, too, to see if my hour was up. Despite her best intentions, Madge could be a little creepy sometimes. But she was also ill, and I didn't want to hurt her feelings. I forced myself to meet her gaze and nodded my head, fixed a smile on my face. I certainly am, Madge, or at least I try my best. Madge leaned back in a chair and her smile widened. I thought so. A second later, something in her eyes, a hint of intensity that had been there a moment before, faded. Her smile disappeared. Her eyes shifted in their sockets, suddenly looking over my shoulder. I took the opportunity to check the watch on my wrist. I'd gone 5 minutes over. Time to go. Well, Madge, I said, standing up and slinging my rucksack over my shoulder. It's been lovely chatting to you, but I have to head off now. I'll see you next week, though. Madge only continued staring past me, off into the corner of the nursing home. I put my other arm through my rucksack and turned to leave. But as I was starting away from Madge's corner of the nursing home lounge, a voice stopped me. I've got something for you, you know. I paused and turned back. Madge was still staring off into the far corner of the room, not looking at me, but now her hands were moving in her lap. As I watched, her gnarled fingers slowly unclenched from one another. I heard the soft rustle of paper. Madge's eyes rolled in their sockets, finding my own. She smiled again. "Didn't you ever use the pass notes at school?" I held the piece of paper in my hand before bed that night. It was a yellow post-it folded into a tiny square. Madge had told me not to open it until I was going to sleep, had made me promise, and for some reason I'd agreed. God knows why. It was probably nothing more than a message to a late husband or a list for shopping she'd never had a chance to go out and buy. I should have unfolded the thing the minute I was outside Eldridge, then tossed it in the nearest bin. But I didn't. For some reason, I didn't. And now, as I held it in my hand beneath the glow of my ceiling light, I thought back to what Madge had said to me earlier. Would you want one last time, or would you want it peaceful? What had she meant by that? For some reason, the words unsettled me a bit. It was almost as if, for a fleeting moment, Madge had known she was old, had known she was ill, had known that maybe, in the not-too-distant future, her days of sitting and talking nonsense with me would be over. But I told myself that couldn't be right. Madge's mind wasn't right. Her question had probably been completely unconnected to the present. It was most likely a snapshot of some other conversation from some other time. As these thoughts went through my head, I opened the post-it note, and I felt myself go cold. There were only 6 words written on that little yellow piece of paper. 6 short words, scrawled in Madge's untidy handwriting. But as I read them, I felt a sick feeling creeping into my stomach, like poison. I got back to the nursing home at 8 AM the next day, left before my parents are up, and cycled there fast, the wind whipping my face as I hammered the pedals. When I finally crunched into Eldridge's gravel driveway 20 minutes later, I was so out of breath I didn't even notice the ambulance and police cars parked near the entrance. Not at first. I noticed the officers standing in the reception area though. Pam, the woman who sits behind the counter, was so busy speaking with them, she didn't even give me a second glance as I rushed by. There were more police in the main hallway leading to the lounge too. I noticed a pair of officers speaking with a balding man in a white coat who I recognized as one of the home's doctors. Their expressions were serious as they spoke in low voices. I hurried by. As I entered the lounge area I'd been sitting in the day before, my heartbeat was fast and hard in my chest. My stomach felt heavy with dread. There were only a few residents in the lounge. A couple of grey-haired women stood by the window in the corner, whispering to each other. A large old man sat in a nearby chair on my left, balancing a coffee cup in one trembling hand. I scoured the room for Madge, but couldn't see her anywhere. Her usual chair was empty. I had no plan in my mind at that point. I just knew I needed to speak to her, needed to ask her about the note. I was about to turn and leave the room when I saw Brenda, the nurse who'd given me advice on my first day. She was standing by a food cart at the far end of the lounge, loading it with dirty mugs and plates. Her face was blank as she worked. I wandered over to her and stood by the cart, waiting for her to notice me. She almost jumped when she finally looked up. Her eyes widened briefly, and then a frown creased her forehead. "Sam, weren't you in yesterday? I thought you only came in once Brenda, do you know where Madge is? I have to speak to her. My words came out in a rushed jumble. I felt cold air blowing in my face from an air conditioning unit overhead. It felt cold in my skin, and I realized I must be sweating. Brenda's frown increased as she stared at me, and then, all of a sudden, it melted away. I saw something else pass behind her eyes, and suddenly realized how pale she looked. She still had a white china mug clutched in one hand, and as she lowered it to the food cart, I saw that she was trembling slightly. Her eyes left my face and scanned the lounge around me, as if she was looking for help. "Oh, Sam, didn't you hear?" "No, of course you wouldn't have. You only just got in. She trailed off and ran a hand through her greying black hair. Brenda is middle-aged and overweight, and right then, I thought she looked almost like a frightened animal, like a badger caught in the headlights. I opened my mouth to respond, but she spoke before I could. The words tumbled out of her mouth in a rush. "It only happened last night, Sam, and we didn't find out until this morning. I don't know why Pam at the reception didn't tell you when you came in. She kept talking, but I could no longer hear what she was saying. My own heartbeat was ringing in my ears. I was picturing Madge sitting in a chair with her hands clasped at her lap. Madge asking me if I'd want one last blowout or something peaceful. Madge pushing her crumpled post-it note into my hand. I turned away from Brenda without saying anything, began walking back across the room. I was faintly aware that she was calling my name, but I didn't turn back. Just kept walking until I was back through the lounge doors, back into the corridor beyond. The doors swung shut behind me, and I leaned against the wall, pulling in deep breaths, waiting for my heartbeat to slow in my chest. After a moment, I shut my eyes and concentrated hard on the rhythm of my breathing, like Mom tells me to do when I'm anxious. In for 3, out for 5, over and over. When I next opened my eyes, I found an old man staring at me. He was stood on the opposite side of the corridor, his back to the wall. I recognized him as the same guy I'd seen on my way into the lounge, drinking coffee in an armchair. He wore a dark blue dressing gown that was hanging open to reveal a stained grey t-shirt and checkered pajama bottoms. The skin on his face was loose and flabby, drooping towards his neck like melted candle wax. His nose was large and curved. I could see a network of little red and purple veins in his cheeks, spreading out below tiny blue eyes that were buried in folds of flesh. Eyes that were fixed on mine. "You missed all the excitement," the man spoke in a thick Dorset accent. I stared back at him, unable to find words. He grinned at me. "Went away in the night, she did," he said. "They went right into a room this morning, and poof, gone. Just like that. Think we don't know what goes on around here, but we do. We talk." He let out a low chuckle that sputtered out into a cough. The sound made my skin crawl. When the man looked back up at me, his blue eyes were watering. "You want to know a secret?" He lowered his voice, glancing up and down the corridor. "When they got in there, all they found on a bed was teeth, like she'd melted into the bloody mattress." I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it. The old man began chuckling again, and I took a breath, waiting for him to finish. "Madge?" I asked, after his laughter had died out. Do you mean Madge? Did something happen to her last night? The old man frowned at me for a second, then broke into a grin. His teeth were even worse than Madge's had been. A dull brown, like the colour of coke. Oh, something happened to her, all right, he whispered. Only, we don't call her Madge round here. What's that? Madge, you said her name was. Only round here, we call her by her middle name, Wendy. The man let out another throaty chuckle. Oh yes, she was always old Wendy to us. I turned and walked away from him on legs that no longer felt like my own. His laughter followed me down the corridor. Once I was back outside Eldridge, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the post-it note Madge had given to me. I think I was hoping the message would be different, but the words were still the same. It read, I killed and ate 13 children. I crumpled the note into a ball and closed my eyes. Mortality is a weird thing. It hits you like a bag of bricks once you make it to your late 20s or early 30s. It's about the time when your family starts getting diagnosed with all kinds of diseases, heart attacks, strokes, cancer. For me, facing mortality meant something as innocuous as finding an old lump on my arm while showering. It might not sound like a big deal, but it's important to note that my younger brother died from osteosarcoma, a fairly aggressive bone cancer, and for him, it was nothing more than a small, tender, unmoving lump he found on his leg. Even then, it was too late, and he died a year later at the age of 7, which meant I was absolutely horrified to discover a similar lump on myself. Over the course of a few days, as I awaited my doctor's appointment, the lump grew ever so slightly. It had a strange shape, like a column of bone that hurt to touch. During examination, the doctor looked at me with concern in his eyes. It pretty much confirmed what I'd already suspected, that the growth was bone, and it would probably turn out to be cancer. He did not hesitate with referring me to a radiologist and told me to return once the imaging had been done. A few days later, I returned, and as I sat in the office on the brink of tears, 1,000 thoughts ran through my head. What to tell my sister? How to spend the remaining time left on Earth? Would it hurt as much as it did with my brother? At the very least, they'd certainly have to amputate my arm, which would severely compromise my gaming abilities. Can you even drive with one arm? Then the doctor called me in. He didn't seem concerned, but baffled, as if he hadn't the faintest clue what was wrong with me. After some consideration, he finally started speaking, unleashing a jumbled mess of medical terms and incomprehensible sentences. He took a deep breath before finally stammering out, It's not cancer." Despite the presumably good news, he didn't seem relieved. There was something he held back. "Then what's wrong?" I asked. It's a tooth." He could not explain it any further, so he just showed me the X-ray. Even with my limited anatomical knowledge, I could see it clear as day. A tooth was growing straight out from my ulnar, its roots firmly cemented in the bone, while the crown pushed on the surrounding tissue. On one hand, it wasn't cancer. On the other, I had an impossible, bizarre growth extruding from the wrong part of my own skeleton. The doctor sat down with me and explained the concept of teratomas, a type of benign tumour that frequently grows hair, skin, and partially developed organs. Despite its unusual presentation, we settled on that idea and scheduled me for surgery. It was a quick and simple procedure. A couple of days later, they discharged me and told me to rest a bit before returning to work. I was content, though admittedly a little bit disturbed by the whole ordeal. Life went on, and my arm healed up nicely, the scar almost completely covered up by the inappropriate amount of hair I'd started growing during my teenage years. A couple of weeks passed, and the surgery was all but a distant memory. Then, after a morning of increasing back pain, I found blood in my urine. Doctors will typically tell you not to get riled up just because you found blood in your pee, because it could be caused by pretty much anything and might not be blood at all. However, I did worry, and with a sense of panic, I rushed to the emergency clinic, where they quickly tested my urine to confirm the presence of hemoglobin. That, alongside my back pain, made them confident I was suffering from nothing more than an innocent little kidney stone. One of the interns performed an ultrasound scan just to rule out cysts and whatnot, but her casual demeanour quickly turned to an expression of fear as she put the sensor against my skin. She excused herself and left the room, only to return after 10 minutes, dragging with her an older, presumably more experienced doctor. He seemed annoyed to have been called in for something so simple as an ultrasound. He grabbed the device without introducing himself and tried to look for a kidney. Just as with the intern, his annoyed confidence quickly turned to one of worry, and he too left without explaining what the hell was going on. By then, my discomfort had turned to excruciating agony. They'd already put me on an overabundance of painkillers, but it barely put a dent in the suffering I had to endure. I stood up to grab a hold of the doctor, ready to demand answers, but once I got to my feet, my vision started fading, and I collapsed to the ground. From there, my memory was hazy. A combination of pain and drugs put me in a trance-like state. I vaguely remember being taken for some sort of scan and a tube being shoved down my throat, and finally, everything turned black. It would take me 2 days to awaken once more, at which point I was greeted by a team of specialists, all looking way out of their depth. They explained as best they could that I'd fallen into a coma following severe internal bleeding, and that I was an inch away from death when I was brought into the operating theatre. And if not for an insane stroke of luck, I wouldn't have realised. Despite the success of the surgery, they still seemed nervous, and I could tell there was more to the story. After a lot of talking around the point, and even more bizarre medical terms I couldn't possibly comprehend, I got mad. "Just tell me what the hell is happening to me." The oldest of the bunch finally stepped up and started explaining himself. "Mr. Woodcombe, to be brutally honest, we haven't the faintest clue what kind of affliction you've come down with. It's quite frankly beyond anything we've dealt with in the past." What does that mean? Am I going to die?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "We can't know how the disease will progress, but what is happening to me?" I yelled as I tried to sit up, still too groggy from the drugs, unable to feel the presence of my own body. He explained what had happened to me, that my stomach had started migrating towards my left flank, where It had enveloped itself around my kidney, slowly but certainly absorbing and digesting it. The process obviously severed its blood supply, which caused a bleed out that almost killed me. They'd fixed the tooth, and they'd stopped the bleeding, but a part of me knew it wasn't over. "I'm still not fixed, am I?" I asked. He shook his head. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Woodcombe, but this disease, we don't know how to stop it. At this point, we're just treating the symptoms." By then, I'd woken up enough to coordinate my movements, but I still couldn't feel my right arm. I turned my head to check on it and saw that the vast majority of my lower and half my upper arm had turned almost completely white. I tried to lift it, but my muscles simply wouldn't budge. The skin looked so smooth, like perfect silk covering an almost shapeless blob. I'd always been a skinny, albeit toned person, so my veins were fairly prominent. Except now, they'd all seemingly vanished from my forearm, leaving nothing but a stump of a vessel I could see actively retreat away under my skin. "It happened before you woke up. There was no time. We couldn't—" "What the hell is happening to me?" I asked once more. "We don't know," he said. I looked at him in despair. These were the people that were supposed to help me. If even the professionals were baffled, I was screwed. "Mr. Woodcombe, your arm has absolutely no blood supply. I'm sorry, but we need to amputate it as quickly as possible. You shouldn't even be awake right now." They made me sign a consent form before proceeding. Just the act of writing my own name with my one remaining functional arm was an excruciating ordeal. Another few hours went by, and my right arm was a part of the past. Once I woke up from my third surgery, the doctors informed me that I was to be transferred to a more specialist health facility. They didn't even have the courtesy to call it a hospital. They airlifted me, wrapped in a containment box of sorts, to prevent the spread of a disease that could potentially be contagious. While flying, I was strapped down with no view of my surroundings. Wherever they were taking me, they would not tell. And based on a few glimpses I got of the world beneath us, I wouldn't have known anyway. On the ground, I was met by a team of doctors dressed in hazmat suits. The health facility looked more like a warehouse than anything else, and didn't ease the growing fear within me. They rolled me through an airlock, ensuring nothing infectious could get in or out. The inside of the facility was a massive, isolated room with hundreds of patients lined up next to each other. No rooms for privacy, nor drapes to keep them apart, which meant they all probably suffered from the same condition as myself. One of the patients stared at me. He panted with shallow breaths as his chest had transformed into a thick wall of bone, each rib fused together, making breathing an almost impossible task. Another, younger woman had skin that seemed to be shrunken a few sizes too small, stretching to the point where it had become a pathetic cover of epithelium, allowing her muscles to be clearly visible. But the worst was the patient in the bed next to mine. All his limbs had been amputated, and the entirety of his skin was covered in thick, bright red arteries, some of them actively bleeding, while others had been burned in a futile attempt at cauterizing them. He groaned in agony, almost inaudible, strained sounds emerging from his toothless, tongueless mouth. His eyes and nose were missing, replaced by seemingly healthy skin, simply grown over most of his orifices, including his ears and scalp. He was trapped in pain, unable to hear, see, or communicate with the world around him. But if he could, I'm certain he would have begged for death. After a couple of hours staring at the horrifically mangled people around me, a doctor approached me. He was a tired-looking old man that had been broken by the afflictions of others. "I'm Dr. Foreman. Your name is Eric Woodcombe, correct?" I nodded. "I'm going to administer a drug. It'll slow down the progression of the disease." "Will it help? Can you help me?" I asked frantically. He looked around, seeming to check if anyone could hear us. "It'll slow it down, but it won't cure it. We're not even sure what causes this disease, but antimitotic drugs seem to put it in a sort of stasis." "What is it exactly?" I asked with a trembling voice. "It's an infection, Mr. Woodcombe, though it's not bacterial, viral, fungal, parasitic, or prion in origin. All I know is that it affects anyone that touches it, and that we're not going to be able to contain it for long." I then asked a question I already knew the answer to. "Am I going to die?" He nodded, his emotionless face never changing. How long do I said, before he interrupted me. "A week, maybe 2. Once the disease has converted all of your organs into an incomprehensible mess, and when the most experienced forensic teams would be unable to recognize your corpse of that of a human being, that's when you'll die." His bedside manner left a lot to be desired, but it was obvious that he'd gone through that speech 100 times before. He was detached, desensitized from the nightmare that surrounded him. As he turned around to leave, I noticed his arm had bone spicules, skeletal spikes protruding through his skin. "Doctor, your arm." He looked down at it and sighed. "I told you it was infectious. Everyone in this room, staff, patients, even the dogs that have lurked around the site. The guys outside wearing hazmat suits have been hunting them down, but it's too late for that. Not that their fancy protection gear will help them, but I'm not going to break that news to them." I was speechless, and he could tell his words hadn't comforted me in the least. He just didn't care. "I'm sorry, but you should make peace with your family, friends, whatever you have in this world. Because if we don't find a viable cure within the next week, they're torching this place." As the days progressed, they kept bringing in more and more patients. Some looked almost normal, healthy even, while others were unrecognizable, their faces replaced by a solid mesh of flesh and their organs relocated to the surface of their skin. One of them had his heart placed outside of his chest, beating as if nothing had happened, with thousands of additional arteries extending from it like a spider web, covering most of his torso. The pain must have been too much, because as he walked past my bed, he grabbed his own heart, attempting to rip it off. A few of the arteries tore open, sputtering crimson blood all around him, but the heart itself wouldn't budge. He groaned, and with one final pull, he fell dead to the ground, clutching a clump of meat he'd managed to pull from the then dead heart. As they lifted his lifeless body onto a stretcher, I got a better look of his face. I realized that I recognized him. He'd been the doctor that examined my lump, the tooth stuck in my bone. He died because of me. On the 5th day of my containment, I started to lose vision in one of my eyes. I could feel it pulsating, growing within its socket, but I didn't dare look at myself in the mirror. A few hours passed, and suddenly I felt a pop, followed by the sensation of a viscous liquid trickling down my face. My eye had exploded. And still, I didn't have the guts to put myself in front of a mirror or to call out for help. In a couple of days, they'll burn this place to the ground in an attempt at preventing the spread of whatever disease has infected us. The doctors aren't hopeful about a cure, but fire seems the safest option, just turning us all to ash. A price worth paying to save the world, I suppose. At least they've given us all a chance to call loved ones. But I don't have much of a family, so to speak. The thing bothering me the most is that I'll most likely die without knowing what killed me, where the disease came from, or how I could have avoided it altogether. Hindsight is 20/20 and all that. Not that it matters to me. I'm already dead. But whatever finally got me, it's still out there. Let me just make something clear. I never get to go out anywhere nice. Like ever. My best friend and I struggle to pay our bills every month, so anything fancier than McDonald's is usually out of the question. We'll save up for months to go on one of our roommate dates, so it's a really special treat. I've never been to the Lotus Bloom before, but it's one of those overpriced pop-ups around the city that everyone has been raving about. We just barely got a reservation, and I was so excited to go. We basically had the menu memorized before we even arrived. But the second we were seated, I see this mother and her kid 3 tables over. Honestly, it kinda shocked me given the price of the place. Of course, I was mostly just worried about the child throwing a temper tantrum and ruining the atmosphere. I mean, look, I'm not a huge kid person, but I don't mind them when they're well behaved, or at least in places they belong. I'm not going to give you the stink eye if your brat is screaming in the middle of Chuck E. Cheese, but this is a nice place with no kids menu and a $40 per plate minimum. Like, who in their right mind takes a little kid here? I tried not to look over, but Steph was obviously annoyed too. The girl looked about 6 or 7, so I thought maybe she was too old to throw a fit at a restaurant, but I didn't count on it. It was just a knee-jerk reaction, you know. I was on edge, anticipating having to deal with another parent who just didn't give a crap if their precious poopsie was bothering the other guests. At any rate, it was relatively quiet so far. We ordered our food, and after chatting for a while, I pretty much forgot all about the kid. Then, the screaming began. There was no warm-up. It went from upscale ambience to a shrill, blood-curdling shriek. I would have thought the kid was being murdered, and I looked over reflexively. However, immediately after that ice pick to the skull, the kid was laughing at the top of her lungs as she ran back and forth down the aisle. The mother, for her part, didn't even seem to notice. Totally detached, staring off into space. So, we all have to deal with it while the mom just blocks it out. I looked around and saw that a few other people were just as annoyed, though none was staring as blatantly as I was. I tried to catch the mother's eye, but she was a million miles away. I waited to see if the waitstaff would do anything, but I figured they weren't allowed to intervene like that. I remember a news story years ago where parents were outraged by a restaurant putting up a sign asking parents to keep their kids well behaved. I felt like getting up and yelling at the woman myself, but I didn't want to end up getting kicked out instead. Now, before you all get mad at me, I'm not hating on the kid herself, just on the fact that this wasn't really the place for her. And honestly, it isn't the kids so much as the people raising them. Can't fault the child, so I tried really hard just to ignore the laughter. Obviously, it's better than screaming. Loud and a bit annoying, but whatever. I didn't want to let it ruin my night. Steph had this super irritated look on her face, and I knew she was thinking the same thing. But none of us said anything. Our food arrived a few minutes later, and it looked even better than the pictures on the site. How often does that happen? For a second, I was too focused on my meal to stress over an unruly child. However, I barely had a fork in my hand when the little girl started shrieking again. I jerked my head over and saw the kid standing next to a table, staring right at her mother and screaming in rage. Again, the mother didn't respond, even when the little girl started knocking cups off the table. The tantrum escalated as the girl began pushing chairs over, but her mom just sat there like nothing was happening. I couldn't believe she was that passive about her kid's behavior, and I tried to catch a gaze so that she would know it. But that was when I noticed the mother's expression. Like, really noticed it. She wasn't just a little spaced out. It was like she couldn't hear the kid at all. In fact, her eyes were kind of glazed over, and for the first time, I saw how pale and exhausted she looked. Maybe that's normal for a parent with a difficult child, but this just seemed different. The sound of shattering glass made me jump, and I realized the girl had managed to break a plate. That was when a server finally approached. Maybe the manager, based on the attire. I was relieved and hoped they'd just ask the woman to go. It was hard not to rubberneck, but I turned back to my plate. Maybe they'd leave without causing a scene. But when the girl screamed again, it was like a shockwave through the restaurant. My water rattled, and Steph and I looked at each other. I heard a strange sound, and when I looked over, I noticed the manager was partially hunched over, his hand on his mouth, and his eyes were closed. As his legs started to buckle, I noticed blood trickling out of his ears. He collapsed, and I could clearly see blood pouring from his mouth and nose too. Most of us stood up then. Some diners ran over to help, calling for someone to dial 911. I noticed people around me with their phones out before I could even reach for mine. But seconds later, the girl was screaming again, and all of the people who'd been trying to help the manager suddenly cried out in agony. Several of them fell over, and the ones who didn't were holding their heads. I noticed that they all had blood trickling from their ears, some from their noses too, even their eyes. I stumbled back and knocked over my chair. Steph was up now too, and we were inches away from the scene. The girl screamed again, and several of the patrons screamed with her as blood gushed from their mouths, eyes, and ears. The rest of them hit the ground. Some of them had their eyes open, unblinking, dead-eyed, like the mother. The little girl turned to face the rest of us, her face red with rage. I can't remember clearly what happened after that. I recall people screaming and pushing, rushing to the doors. Steph and I were just far enough back to avoid getting trampled as tables and chairs and people alike were shoved out of the way. When the girl screamed again, all I could hear was ringing. I cringed and grabbed my ears. They were wet. For a moment, my vision swayed, and I thought I might pass out. Beside me, Steph had fallen to her knees. I gritted my teeth and grabbed her by the elbow, hurrying to the exits as fast as I could. But when I got there, I saw people freaking out, banging on the doors and windows, unable to open them. There were people at the emergency exit, people throwing chairs at the glass. The doors weren't budging. My ears throbbed, but my hearing was starting to come back now. I looked over and saw the little girl crawling up to the level where all of us were huddled. Tables and chairs began to topple out of her way, without her even touching them. My adrenaline was too high to really process what I was seeing. I just knew we had to get out of there. There were no other options, so I grabbed Steph and made a run for the back. I figured there had to be an exit through the kitchen, though I feared it would be blocked too. It was better than just standing there either way. Once we reached the kitchen, however, I quickly realized I wasn't the only one with that idea. We met an aggressive crowd, pushing through the small space in a frenzy. If we tried to push through, we'd probably be injured. When the girls screamed again, even from the other room, the pots on the stove exploded, covering people with boiling water. Some of the burners were still on, and fire burst through the air, spreading over the panicked patrons. I froze, watching people burn alive before me, until Steph grabbed my hand and pulled. Together, we ran down the back hall. It was a dead end, but for the bathrooms. The handicapped restroom was the only one that was single stall, the only room that locked. We ran inside and secured it, then put our legs up against the door from that position to make it harder to open. Of course, putting pressure on the door won't stop it from being ripped off its hinges, and I get the feeling that our efforts are pointless. I tried 911 several times, but all I heard was a sharp, static kind of sound. The screaming outside of the room was so loud, I felt like it was cutting through me. It went on for a long, long time. Steph and I have been in here now for a good half hour. The screams have gradually died down. It's gotten pretty quiet. We talked about checking to see what was happening, but I don't think it's such a good idea. Especially not when it's so silent after all that. Even if people had managed to escape, it wouldn't be this still. I can hear steps though, echoing down the hallway. Someone is heading our way. Short, bouncy steps. Skipping maybe. Steph is reaching for my hand. I guess I am done typing anyway. Have you ever noticed gaps in your schedule? Little dead zones, perhaps only a few minutes long, that can't ever be properly accounted for? Or perhaps more accurately, periods of time where you always wind up in a certain place or away from another? Quite possibly not. I've only noticed one in my life, and it took years. See, I'm a university student in southwestern Ontario. It's more or less the southernmost point in Canada. So far south, in fact, that to get to America, we travel north. But that's neither here nor there. What is important, though, is that I have a class from 4 in the afternoon until 5:20. All the classes are staggered like that, 10 minutes after the half-hour mark, presumably to give students time to cross campus and get to their next classes. My 4 p.m. class isn't the most thrilling, if I'm honest, but it's in my major, so I deal with it. Besides, as a general rule, I'm a good student. Not the kind who spends every waking moment in the library, obsessing over that 94% they got because they'll drop their average by 0.2%, of course. but I make it a rule not to skip lectures. This week, I made an exception. Now, that Sunday, I'd been hanging out with some friends of mine, perhaps a half dozen or so, all as a group. I'm an introvert by nature, and as much as I enjoy spending time with them, it usually makes the next day an emotional drudgery to do so. It was even worse this time. See, there's this girl there. I don't think I need to say anything more about that, frankly. Everybody in the world knows what it means when a 20-something-year-old guy says, "There's this girl." I could go on about her for hours, but nobody wants that. What's important is that I'm attached to her, shall we say. And she spent the evening fawning over the new guy in our group, Daniel. Really, I don't have any right to be upset. She and I have never been an item. So reasonably, I know you're all going to say I should just brush it off. Plenty of fish in the sea, and every other platitude people say. I know that almost every one of you has moped about a guy or girl in their lifetime, so sue me. The takeaway from all that is that I was miserable. Miserable for a juvenile reason, I accept, but miserable nonetheless. My car had been out of commission for the better part of a month too, so I had to get a ride from a friend, who got me on campus 10 minutes after my class started. That was really my screw it moment. I didn't want to go to class, and I definitely didn't want to walk all the way home. If I'd called my friend back, he would have picked me up again in a heartbeat, but he's also the sort who'd want to know why I was skipping class. That really wasn't a conversation I wanted to have at the time, so I decided to just walk around the campus for the hour or so remaining before I could get picked up without suspicion. The semester had just started a week or two ago, and the weather was nice, so there were still people milling about campus, just socializing. I walked around, trying my best to blend in as if anyone had interest in one particular student wandering the grounds. When the crowds began to thin out around 4:30, I was pleasantly surprised. I mentioned earlier that I'm an introvert, so being able to wander freely amidst the towering buildings and well-tended gardens while also being isolated from other people was a rare treat. This feeling didn't exactly diminish as more and more people headed inside, but there was a nagging feeling of wrongness about the situation. Eventually, the entire campus was deserted, which was unheard of to me. I'd been there at 2 a.m. and seen a handful of students drifting from place to place or sleeping on a bench outside. But for some reason, it was as though everybody on campus had subconsciously decided to head inside at 4:45 that afternoon. From the outside, the entire university might as well have been a ghost town. It was at this point I instinctively felt something was wrong. For the past 10 minutes or so, I'd felt a subtle urge to head inside, but by now, it felt absolutely imperative. I was heading into the chemistry building when I suddenly stopped. Having the entire campus to myself was a dream come true, and frankly, I kind of hoped the feeling of danger would turn out to be justified. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't suicidal, but at that point, I would have accepted any distraction from my experience that weekend. I closed the class door to the chem department without entering and turned around. Somehow, in the moment between my opening the door and my decision to remain outside, the world changed. It wasn't an obvious change, but it was there. Almost something you could feel in the air rather than see. The air felt hollow, for lack of a better word, empty. You know that feeling of rich air you get when you breathe in a truly fresh breath? There wasn't any of that. But neither was the acrid stench of pollution, or even the stale feeling of air that remained stagnant in a room too long. Aside from the physical feeling of air filling and emptying my lungs, I felt absolutely nothing when breathing. The second thing I noticed was the sun. It felt paler, and it was tinted green. Not a harsh green, not enough to colour the landscape, but enough that the warm glow was gone, replaced by something almost cadaverous. It felt harsher than usual too, though it provided no heat to my body. I wasn't sure what to make of these changes. I was certainly aware of them, but they were subtle enough to make me question whether it was all in my head. I left the chemistry building and began wondering once more. The term barren is the only way I can possibly describe the feeling. The entire property felt lifeless, not just in the sense that there were no people in sight, but the animals were gone, and even the plants didn't seem to be alive in any real way. The grass was still there, green as ever, but it looked dull and flat, rather than vibrant. The geese that usually cover the grounds were nowhere to be seen, and even the trees seemed to be little more than husks with waxen leaves. I continued to explore this desolate world, seeking objective evidence that things had changed, or that I was simply imagining all this. Within a minute or two of light exertion, I began to feel out of breath. I'm no star athlete, but usually I could go further than this without getting winded. This was the third thing that felt wrong, though it was quickly overshadowed by all that followed. There's a large tower in the very center of our campus, held up by grand concrete pillars spaced about a car lengths apart. It was there that I began to tire, and so it was there that I stopped to catch my breath. I leaned against one of the pillars, breathing heavily. I was only there for a moment, however, before there was a grating sound, and I found myself on the ground, with the section of pillar I had been leaned against crushed beneath me. Somehow, it had sheared off the pillar in a large, sharp chip. I stood up, confused, and pressed my hand to the pillar. For a moment, it felt solid, but then it gave way beneath the pressure, crumbling into a fine powder. It felt almost like burnt out wood that had retained its shape, but crumbled to ash when touched. Even as my mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened, a sound arose from the area behind me. A sliding, skittering sound that made me think of insects and vermin, though somehow more sinister. I turned my head and saw a terrifying creature rounding the corner of the building and heading my way. It was big, at least as long as a small bear, and covered in black, reflective chitin. It was built roughly like a scorpion, though it didn't have the claws, rather two jointed appendages that ended in a sharp point. It was running along the wall of the building, its legs digging into the crumbling concrete and moving at an astonishing rate. I didn't stop to get a closer look. I screamed and ran, forgetting my fatigue. My entire body felt cold, hot, and numb at the same time as adrenaline began to pour into my system. I didn't have to turn around to know that thing was following me. I could hear its feet digging into the chalk-like ground, chipping it and tearing the concrete apart as it chased me. I sprinted towards the first building I saw, the biology building. I yanked on the handle. The metal door handle bent and twisted as I pulled, and it left flakes of rust on my hand. But the glass door opened. I dashed inside and slammed it behind me. I don't know why I thought the glass door would offer me even a moment's protection, but it seemed to work, because the creature didn't immediately follow me in. The lights were out in the building. Nothing else seemed to be out of place. There was no debris. The walls were intact, and the floor was clean. But I couldn't see any further than what was illuminated by the pale sunlight streaming through the glass door. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I didn't want to go back outside. So I turned on my phone's flashlight and headed further in. The biology building smelled. It always had. It smelled of frogs and chemicals, which always confused me because I'd assumed university students would be well past the days of dissecting frogs. Today was no exception. The further I went inside, the more it smelled of that peculiar mix of earth and fish. I didn't harbour much hope of finding anyone inside, even though I knew there were classes being held in there at this time. I just instinctively knew that they and I weren't in the same building. The unlit corridors proved that. The elevator didn't respond when I called it either. I wouldn't have gotten in even if it had, but I was curious. I'd been wandering the halls pretty much aimlessly, trying to think of a way out, when I heard the sound again. It was slower this time, more deliberate, as though it were trying to be as quiet as possible. I'd slowly made my way to the 4th floor, and the sound was coming from somewhere underneath my feet. So getting out of the building wasn't an option. I had to hide, and fast. I crept along the hallway as quietly as I could, without making noise, and headed into the first door I saw. My phone light was terribly inadequate for the purpose, and I had no idea which room I'd stumbled into. When I looked up and saw another person staring at me, I almost screamed, and so did he. It took me a moment to work out that I was in the bathroom, staring into a mirror. It was foggy and discoloured a pale yellow, but I could still see myself through it, and I didn't like what I saw. My reflection was pale, almost ashen, and visibly shaking. My eyes were bloodshot, and I swear I was thinner than when I woke up. Not skin and bones, but noticeably thinner. I took a step closer to inspect myself more thoroughly, when I heard the creature again. It was undeniably close. Right outside the door, I suspected. Then came the scratching, definitely on the bathroom door, and I could see it boring inwards with every scratch. I began to feel dizzy, and I leaned back against the sink, which promptly crumbled and left me sitting on the floor amidst a pile of ceramic rubble. The door continued to bow inward and started to splinter, and I could see the creature's legs poking through the gap between the frame and the door itself. I began to hyperventilate, and I raised my hand to the door in a futile effort to stave off the inevitable, when I was suddenly blinded by a bright light. I blinked, stunned, and saw that the power was back online. The door was back in its frame, and the sink was attached to the wall again. I could hear chairs sliding and students leaving their classes. Then I heard a girl scream from right beside me. Apparently, this particular washroom was the girls' washroom, and it had been occupied. I left the bathroom as quickly as I could, half running, half stumbling with my legs barely able to support me. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror as I ran out, and saw that I was still looking half dead and sick. When I burst out the door, I was relieved by the familiar, warm glow of the sun, now its rightful orange colour and properly comforting. I saw no trace of the creature, nor the damage I had left on the crumbling buildings. The next day, I saw my doctor. I was immediately hospitalised due to my complexion, weight loss, and some pretty alarming results from my blood work. The doctor couldn't properly explain what had happened. He said that if he didn't know any better, he'd say I was a textbook case for radiation poisoning, but there was no potential cause and I was recovering too quickly. Apparently, I'd simply suffered massive cell death across every system of my body for no clear reason. Fortunately, their treatment was simple. It basically boiled down to bed rest and good nutrition. I was home in a few days, though still not at full strength. I checked the university's course calendar. There are no courses that start at 5 p.m, nor are there any courses that end at 4:50 p.m. There aren't any exams at that time, or even extracurricular programs, and there weren't any last semester or the one before. There is absolutely nothing to give anyone reason to wander the campus any time around 5 p.m. It's as if the entire university has decided they want nothing to do with that particular time, and nobody finds that strange. I wouldn't either if I hadn't gone through all that. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that day. They'd think I'd gone insane. I was worried for a while that they might be right, but when I remembered my experience at the hospital, that was all the proof I needed. And when I'm in my class around 5, sometimes I'll look out the window. I see the sun shining the same way it always has. I see the trees swaying in the wind. I see lights in the other buildings and professors giving lectures, but I never see anyone outside. You realize how much trouble you're in? Mrs. Yvette, my principal, asked me. I didn't even damage any property, I said. All I did was place them in there. You put more than 50 rubber duckies in the toilets, Mrs. Yvette replied in anger. But that's funny, I said. This wasn't even the first senior prank this year, and mine is mild compared to the last one. How did you even find out that I did it? The school's never had security cameras. That doesn't matter, she said. Now listen here, Alan. I'm not going to sit here and argue with you anymore. You should be thankful I'm not suspending you. However, not only are you going to have detention after school every day for the rest of the school year, but you will have to work during the school day until the end of the year as well. Mrs. Yvette then proceeded to explain that I would be in the library helping Miss Burrowicz. She was the new librarian that was hired about a week beforehand after our last librarian, Mrs. Smith, was fired after being arrested for drunk driving. Apparently, Miss Burrowicz had retired a year ago after working at a different school. However, due to Mrs. Smith's arrest and subsequent firing, my school hired Miss Burrowicz on a last-minute notice. Almost immediately after she was hired, however, Miss Burrowicz was involved in a pretty serious car accident. She supposedly suffered nerve damage in her left arm, so she wouldn't be able to do much physical work around the library. I learned later that she had asked Mrs. Yvette if she could find students to help her during the day, and Mrs. Yvette told her that she would send students who got in trouble as punishments. Mrs. Yvette told me that I wouldn't be stuck working in the library alone. Another student I was acquainted with, Derek, would also be volunteering. He got in trouble because he jumped onto the field during a baseball game. Derek would have to do it for 3 weeks, while I would for 4 weeks, which was the remaining amount of weeks in the school year. On our first day of volunteering, we walked into the library to find Miss Burrowicz already waiting for us. She was an elderly lady with pretty generic features. However, she had these huge, beady eyes that seemed to stare straight through you. Her left arm was also in a sling. Hello, boys. So glad you have decided to help me for the next few weeks. Very kind of you, she said sarcastically. Follow me. She led us over to the checkout counter. On top of the counter was a large orange drink dispenser with a small bucket on the ground below it. Plastic cups were stacked neatly next to it. What is that? I whispered to Derek. Some homemade drink Miss Burrowicz brings to school, Derek whispered back. Once we were behind the counter, she began to whisper to us. So, this is how it's going to work. I can't do anything because of doctor's orders, so I'm going to delegate all the work to you. Whenever a student wants to check out a book, you ask for his or her name and scan it. When a student returns a book, you scan it again and mark it on the computer that it is returned. We place all the returned books on a small cart, and after some time, you will have to bring the books and place them back where they belong. You will also have to monitor students at the computers to make sure they're doing actual work, and if they're not, you tell them to get off. Sounds simple, right? We nodded silently. Okay, Derek, you monitor for now. Alan, you stay here and scan any books students bring to you. Derek and Miss Burrowicz both walked off, leaving me on my own to manhandle the desk. I should mention here that I noticed, while fiddling with the computer, that each faculty member seemed to have access to everything on the school database. I could go in the files and delete a student's profile, which would make them no longer appear as a student at my school. I found it perplexing that each and every faculty member had complete access on the database, but I didn't fiddle with it too much. The last thing I needed was to possibly get into more trouble. Only 1 or 2 kids came over to check out or return books, but a lot of people came over to fill water bottles and plastic cups with this red drink. Like, every minute someone came up and got a drink. I found it surprising that my school would let people eat and drink in the library, let alone have a drink dispenser operate inside of it. I was intrigued to say the least. So when I saw my friend, Angela, coming over to the counter with a bottle in her hand, I decided to ask her about it. Looks like you're enjoying your community service, she said, teasingly. Yeah, I'm also in love with it right now, I responded sarcastically. Why are so many people drinking this? Oh my gosh, it's so good, she said. Ever since she was hired, Miss Burrowicz has brought this drink to school every day. She apparently did this at her old school years ago, and it was popular there as well. She makes it at home and refills the cooler in the morning before school, which is impressive considering her injury. I'm honestly surprised she never runs out during the day. Pretty much everyone I know drinks it. After she said that, I realized I'd seen a lot of people drinking a red-colored liquid the past couple of days, but I'd assumed it was just a drink the cafeteria workers made. I never went in the cafeteria since I always brought lunch from home and ate with my friends outside, but I also never went into the library outside of being forced to. My close friends didn't drink it around me as well, so I never knew where the drink came from. I've never had it before, I said. Really? Why not? She asked. Well, for one, I never knew of this drink until today. And second, I probably can't drink it to begin with. What do you mean? What flavour is it? Strawberry. Yep, can't drink that. I'm allergic to strawberries. Damn, that sucks. It is what it is. Oh well, she said. And with that, she walked back over to a table while beginning to drink the juice. After 30 boring minutes passed, Miss Burrowicz came back out of her office and told us we could leave and get ready for our next class. I went home that night and told my mom about my first day stuck in the library. She too seemed surprised about the drink, given how she thought there would be a no-food policy or something for that place. She did ask me if I could bring her some, so the next day I brought home a small bottle of the juice for her. She asked me about my day and such before taking a sip of it. She said it tasted really good, telling me that she may want me to bring the drink home more often. After telling her about how I did in my physics test, I went back up to my room. I was listening to a podcast on my phone when my mom walked into my room. Hey, how did you do on your physics test? She asked me. Um, I did fine, I said. I just told you that like 10 minutes ago. Wait, you did? She asked, a confused look on her face. Yeah, I responded. Oh, well, okay, she said. Guess I must have had a brain fart or something. She then left my room and went back downstairs. I thought that was pretty weird, but let it go without much concern. The next morning, I was talking to my friend and neighbour, Kiefer, while we were walking from the student parking lot towards the school. We were talking about random stuff before I brought up our physics test. For once, I think I did well on a physics test, I said. What about you? Kiefer stopped walking, and I turned around to see him with a flummoxed expression on his face. We had a physics test yesterday? He asked me. Yeah, you took it yesterday in class with me, I said, thinking he was just joking. I don't remember taking a test, he said, now paranoid. I just stared at him for a good minute, and then he started freaking out, saying he could barely remember anything from yesterday after study hall period. I helped reconnect the dots with him, and he seemed to calm down after that. It was then I noticed he had an empty bottle with red residue on the bottom of it inside the pocket of his backpack. But from that point on, I started to notice that people were forgetting little things here and there. It wasn't anything big, but it was like minor details were slipping out of people's minds. I tried to bring it up to Derek, but he didn't seem to notice anything, and he actually asked me whether or not I was losing it. Honestly, I thought I was losing my mind, but tried not to focus on it. The last thing I needed was to have a mental breakdown near the tail end of my senior year. Time passed, and Derek was about to finish his sentence on what should have been his last day. However, he didn't show up to school. I texted him again and even tried calling him after I got home, but he didn't respond. Later that weekend, I decided to go to his house to check on him. I knew he lived in my neighbourhood, a few blocks away, so I was able to quickly make my way to his house. I rang the doorbell and waited for someone to answer. I could see that there were lights on through the glass front door, so I thought somebody would be home. However, about 5 minutes passed and nobody came to the door. I tried the doorknob, and then the door slowly opened. I looked around, making sure the coast was clear, and then walked in. Nobody was home, so I assumed they must have been out doing something. However, when I walked by their answering machine, I discovered that they had many missed calls and voicemails. I also discovered that there were numerous packages and envelopes in their mailbox, something I'd missed when I walked up to their house. After walking around a bit, I found the door to the garage. I opened it and found 2 cars parked inside. The car keys were in a bowl next to the door. I knew Derek didn't have his own car yet, but I also knew he was an only child with married parents, so those cars should have been the only ones Derek's family owned. I got very creeped out by it all and went back home. Given that I'd practically trespassed on their property, I didn't tell my mom about what I saw. I just said Derek wasn't home, and she responded that he was probably fine and that he would be back Monday. When Monday pulled around, however, Derek was still a no-show, and he didn't show up the next couple of days as well. Later that week, I mentioned to my counsellor that I was worried about Derek, but she didn't even know who I was talking about. Even worse, when she went on a computer to look up his profile, she found nothing. I stared at her, dumbstruck, all while a large bottle filled with red liquid sat atop a desk. I asked other students, but nobody I'd asked seemed to remember Derek. Even worse, when I asked my mom that night, She didn't remember him, even though we spoke about him the previous day. Derek didn't have any social media accounts, so I couldn't even prove his existence other than text messages. I thought I was going insane. How could he just vanish off the face of the earth? When my final day finally arrived, I was relieved. My last day of detention was the day before, so I could at least go home and probably book myself an appointment with a mental professional. However, Miss Burrowicz asked me during my last shift if I could stay after school to help her move some stuff since it was my last day, and I stupidly agreed. That afternoon, I asked Miss Burrowicz about Derek, but as expected, she had no clue who I was talking about. She said I was the only one who had volunteered and thanked me for all I had done. Her arm was still in a sling, but she said she would be out of it soon. "Has your mom enjoyed my drink?" she asked. "Yeah, a little too much in my opinion," I said. She smiled and said, "I'm surprised you didn't drink it that much yourself." "Oh, well, I couldn't," I said. "I'm allergic to strawberries." Her smile abruptly faded and was replaced with a stunned expression. "Wait, you never drank it?" "Nope." She remained quiet and continued to stare at me for another minute before telling me to follow her into her office. We walked down the hallway to a door. She opened it, and my eyes immediately fixated on the wall behind a desk. It was covered in Polaroid photographs. Many smiling faces stared back at me, students and adults alike. "I wanted to show my photo album, if you would like to call it that," she said. "Do you mind if I add your photo to it?" Sure," I said, feeling a little creeped out. She went to the corner of the room and brought out a weird-looking camera. It looked like it was made up of recycled camera parts, combined to make one unique look. "I put this bad boy together myself," she said. "Those photos act as a permanent reminder of all my favorite students and people from the places I have worked." "Uh-huh," I said slowly. "All right now, just stand still and look directly into the lens. There is a flash just to let you know. Big smile." I forced myself to smile and waited for the flash, but nothing happened. She looked confused and analyzed the camera. "Oh crap, I need film," she said. "Don't move, I'll be right back." With that, she scurried out of the room and down the hall. While she was gone, I decided to examine the photos on the wall. While scanning the many faces, my eyes fell upon a recognizable face. There, staring back at me, his bright smile flashing out the picture, was Derek. Chills went down my spine when I saw his photo. Miss Burrowicz said she didn't know him. Yet, here was his photo on the wall. What the hell was going on? I was losing it, and in a completely impulsive act, I grabbed the photo and ripped it to shreds. I don't know what compelled me to do that, but I did it. "Where am I?" I heard someone ask behind me, not even 5 seconds after I tore up the photo. I turned to see Derek, bent over on the ground. "Derek? Are you all right?" I asked in pure shock. "Where the hell have you been?" "What do you mean?" he asked, still confused. "You've been missing for the last week," I said, while helping him to his feet. "What?" he asked. "What happened?" I asked. "I don't know. The last thing I remember was Miss Burrowicz asking me to come into her office. Then she showed me her camera and asked for a photo of me. And then..." He paused and looked at the wall and the ripped photo on the ground before facing me. His eyes were wide and filled with utter terror. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." Before I could respond, I heard a loud thump, and Derek fell limp to the ground behind him. Behind him, holding a metal baton in her left hand, was Miss Burrowicz. "You fool," she yelled. "What have you done?" She swung at me, but I dodged the swing and bolted out of the room. It was after school and the last school day of the year, so nobody was around. I ran to my car and sped all the way home. My mom found me out of breath and in hysterics. I told her to call the police, that I'd witnessed my friend get attacked right in front of me. She thankfully did so. A police officer came by to ask me questions, while others went to investigate the school. The next day, I learned some details from the officer who interviewed me. What he told me still haunts me to this day. Her photo collection was gone, and Derek was nowhere to be found. Besides a pool of blood on the ground, all they found was the camera and a single photo on the ground. A photo of Miss Burrowicz smiling at the camera while standing next to Derek's body. My son Joshua was a huge scaredy cat until the age of 8. Every Halloween, when the other kids would dress up in their spooky costumes and roam door to door, Josh would close his curtains and wrap himself up in bed, no matter how much we tried to convince him to go out and play. He was always afraid of the dark, even if he wasn't alone. Once he fell over and scraped his knee, and the sight of his own blood made him hyperventilate. My wife, Nancy, and I were worried he would never grow out of it. That's why I was surprised when, on the day after his 8th birthday, he asked me if he could have his own room. Before then, he had always slept in the same room as his older brother, Tim, because of his night fears. Nancy seemed glad that he seemed willing to be more independent, so I obliged, and we cleared out our guest room for him to move in. We thought he was growing up. Maybe he'd gotten to the stage where he realized there was no such thing. For a while, I thought he might change his mind after being alone for a few nights, but he did fine for months. We were relieved that he'd finally passed that milestone at least. Somewhere in the back of my mind, however, I remember thinking his request seemed a bit out of character at the time. A few months later, I was watching Josh and his brother play in the front yard through my bedroom window when I spotted Josh squatting down on the sidewalk. He seemed to be looking at something on the ground. Upon further inspection, it was the grisly sight of a pigeon that had been run over. Its head had been crushed completely, brains and blood splattered into the concrete. I was very alarmed to see Josh poking its dead body with his finger, and at that point decided it was necessary to intervene. Running downstairs, I shouted at the boys to leave the bird corpse alone and gave them a lecture about hygiene. Before I let Josh go, I pulled him back and asked, "Didn't that scare you? Like all that blood?" "Dr. Fearless told me blood isn't scary," he replied. "The ambulance men and policemen see it all the time. It's just something that comes out of your body. Nothing to be afraid of." "That's brave of you. Just be careful when you see it. It can be a sign of danger." "I know." I assumed Dr. Fearless was some cartoon character or something he'd seen in a comic. Back then, I was pretty thankful for whatever it was. It helped him overcome one of his greatest fears much more than we ever could. Throughout the year, it seemed like he was getting braver. He wasn't afraid of spiders around the house anymore, or being alone in the dark. And when October rolled around, He even went trick-or-treating for the first time and had a great time with his friends. Things took an odd turn when I walked into his room one late night to tell him to go to bed. He had headphones on, so his reaction was delayed. But as soon as he saw me, he closed the browser window before I had a chance to see what was on it. "Josh, are you watching something bad?" "No." He looked around, slightly shocked. After a few seconds of silence, I left him alone and went back to bed. It'll seem less like an invasion of privacy if I catch him watching his porn red-handed instead of forcing him to show it to me and making things awkward, I thought. I talked to Nancy about it, and she said she'd be on the lookout. A week later, she reported back with some worrying findings. Josh had apparently been short-tempered and isolating himself more in his room. My wife checked his laptop browser history while he was at school and took a picture of what was there. His most recent searches included scariest movies, surgery pictures, serial killers, murder, dead body. When we confronted him about this after he came home from school, he burst into tears and mentioned that Dr. Fearless told him it was good to look at scary things more often because he would get used to them. He said it worked, and a lot of the things he used to be afraid of no longer scared him because of it. "He's a doctor I've been talking to," Josh replied. "He helps children not be afraid." Nancy and I looked at each other. "You talk to him?" I asked. "We send each other emails. He's been helping me overcome my fears, things like blood and ghosts and serial killers. I talk to him whenever I'm feeling scared, and he always finds a way to make me feel better." "But he's not someone you've met before?" No. I haven't seen him in real life." "Haven't we ever told you not to talk to strangers?" I said in a concerned tone. "I'd like to see those emails," Nancy interjected. Josh handed over his laptop reluctantly. "It's late. You should sleep now, son," I said. "We'll have a chat about this in the morning." He went back to bed, and we began to look through his inbox, which was still logged in. I spotted the email address and opened up a long list of back-and-forth emails between my son and Dr. Fearless. His very first email read, "Dear Dr. Fearless, my name is Josh and I am 7 years old. I am always scared of things like blood and bugs and skeletons. My friends make fun of me and it makes me sad, so please help me not be scared anymore. From Josh." I noticed the first reply came within 5 minutes of him sending that email. "Dear Josh, thank you for writing. I can definitely help you overcome your fears if you agree to have a go at my free 10-stage coaching program for kids. It's definitely a beginner-friendly program. For each stage, there are 100 items. I will email you a set of 10 items each day. An item can be a picture, a video, or an audio clip. All you have to do is email me back describing each item within 24 hours. And if I am satisfied with your reply, I will send you the next step. Don't worry if you don't get some right first time. You can just try again. If you need a time extension or have any other problems, please let me know. The last stage is a little bit different, but we'll get to that later. I promise that once you finish all 10 stages of the program, you will truly be fearless. You will never be afraid of all things horror again, and you will be much braver than your friends. Love, from Dr. Fearless." "Dear Dr. Fearless, okay, I want to do this. Thank you. From Josh." The email reply after contained no body text, just 10 attachments. I opened them up, and there were 10 pictures of stuff that might be considered scary to kids, but nothing out of the ordinary. Josh had replied back with numbered descriptions of each picture no longer than a sentence each. Number 1, cartoon ghost with a smiley face. Number 2, a dark street. Number 3, a Halloween pumpkin, and so on. Dr. Fearless replied the next day, "Well done, Josh. That wasn't so bad, was it? Here's your second test." The second set also contained 10 images of pretty much the same kind of stuff. They emoed back and forth, each set of the first stage containing 10 mildly spooky images, but nothing out of the ordinary. After the 10th set of stage 1, Josh received this email about 2 weeks later than when he sent the first one. "Dear Josh, congratulations. You finished the first stage of the course, and by now you should be feeling a bit more familiar with some of the things you thought were scary. They aren't too bad when you get used to them, are they? If you would like to see more items from the first stage, please let me know. If not, we will begin stage 2 tomorrow. It will work just like the first stage. I send you the item list, and you describe the items. Keep going. You're doing great, and you'll be fearless in no time. Love, from Dr. Fearless." The second stage was much like the first, with a few more odd images between the normal ones. Not that this whole thing was normal at all, but this was when my heart rate began to increase. The cartoon ghosts and skeletons were still there. This time, he gradually added in some creepy doll pictures, clown images, people making weird faces, anatomical drawings. Nothing extreme, but stuff you really wouldn't expect any doctor or counselor to send to a child for any therapeutic reason. Josh did tell him some of the images made him feel uncomfortable, and the solution was to just send more sets of images similar to those. Sometimes Dr. Fearless would explain what was in an image and why it wasn't scary. It seemed to take a lot of extra sets for him to adjust to everything. But once he wasn't scared of anything in stage 2 anymore, they moved onto stage 3. There were many more real-life photographs rather than drawings or cartoons in stage 3. People with common injuries like cuts on their arms and legs, bruises and the like. The fear factor was ramped up a little, and many of the images you might expect to see during the milder parts of a horror movie. Dark tunnels, prisons, isolated places. Again, this stage took longer to complete than expected, as Josh asked for more sets. But eventually, he got bored of the items and said he was ready to progress. I turned to Nancy, ready to discuss how weird this was, but she had fallen fast asleep. Scrolling through the emails, I moved on to reading stage 4. Through stages 4, 5 and 6, the images kept on getting scarier. Pictures of injuries became more graphic. The dark scene images transitioned into screenshots of ghosts from horror movies. Stage 7 was a whole new level of disturbing. Screenshots of faces from horror movies and game jump scares. Disturbing images like a huge spider and its babies in the corner of a room. Other stuff you would expect most kids and even adults to get scared by. However, the gradual desensitization process progressed in such a subtle way that Josh's replies seemed as if he wasn't finding the images too bad. If he did mention an image he didn't like much, he would get sent more similar sets like before, until he had seen and described so many that he got bored. Some sets could take weeks to complete, but once finished, he was fully desensitized to all images of that nature. Stage 8 focused on body horror, and was a gradual progression from images of corpses to fully mutilated bodies with awful injuries. I was incredibly disturbed by every single item in this stage, but it seemed like Josh hadn't even noticed how horrific these images were. Perhaps it was the relatively smooth transition from the last stage to the next, he described the pictures in a cold and disregarding way. Number 1, dead man with bruises on his back. Number 2, woman with head split open in 3 bits. Number 3, woman with no arms. Most worryingly, I reverse searched some of the images, and while most could be found on websites as movie scenes or even actual crime scene photos, some couldn't be found online. Shaking, I scrolled down past all the gore to stage 9. No more images. Every item in this stage was a video in MP4 format. It started with clips of horror movie jump scares, then moved on to more and more disturbing imagery until I literally saw people being burned alive, tortured and mutilated, and killed in brutal ways. The last set that Josh had received was set 10 out of 10 in stage 9. Among the horrifying videos was a clip of a man having his eyes gouged out, a woman flayed alive, and the demonstration of a Colombian necktie. I couldn't believe some random creep had been sending my child things like this for the past year. I couldn't believe I hadn't found out sooner. Luckily, Josh hadn't replied to that last email yet. I looked through the message history again, scrolling back through hundreds of emails, and noticed there was one crucial missing puzzle piece. My heart in my mouth, I leapt out of bed and ran to Josh's room, shaking him and waking him up. "Josh, I need you to tell Daddy something honestly," I said, trying to keep my tone calm despite my inner terror and panic. "Huh?" He rubbed his eyes sleepily. "I saw your emails to Dr. Fearless. This person was sending you inappropriate things no child should see, and you should have known that and told us. But you sent the first email to Dr. Fearless. How did you know about him? Where did you get his email?" After I heard his reply, I called the police immediately. He thought. "It was written on the inside of a bathroom stall at school, I think." I'm glad I did, because the next email said that the item in stage 10 was apparently in the park behind the school at 11 p.m. So, I just want to say, I'm not a nosy person. I genuinely try my very best to mind my own business, and I believe that most people are victims of circumstance. Doing something like this isn't at all like me, but you have to understand that I did what I did because I felt like I had no choice. I know that in situations like mine, you're meant to turn to the police. But the thing is, I've called them multiple times and they won't do anything. For whatever reason, my neighbour hides his dog whenever the police visit. I don't know how he manages to hide it, but he clearly does a very good job, because now the police have said they'll charge me with harassment if I try to report my neighbour one more time. As far as they are concerned, my neighbour doesn't have a dog. To be fair, you wouldn't be blamed for missing the signs either. His house is an absolute mess, and his backyard is even worse. It's not like his garden has a doghouse with a bone-shaped water bowls nearby. There are no chew toys, no dog food lying amongst the piles of trash that fill his yard and home, and you'll never hear any barking. Looking outside in, all of the usual signs of a dog being present aren't there. In fact, for the first month I lived here, I didn't even know there was a dog next door. That's pretty weird because I work from home, but I guess it was because I never heard or saw anything, and I never had much reason to give it much thought. It was only when I moved my desk one day, so it faced the neighbour's yard, that I actually looked outside and saw it. The poor thing just sits outside, staring at my neighbour's house. This happens no matter what time of year it is. I've seen that dog out there in the snow, rain, hail, and blistering heat. As far as I can tell, it never even gets to go inside. Why anyone would get a dog only to confine it in a way that they never actually enjoy its company, I simply don't know. But outside of a small spot where that poor thing hides below the house, just out of sight, it spends its entire time staring at the back wall. Since then, I've watched my neighbour come home every day, and I see the dog running into its little burrow below the house. I think it might have taken to hiding when the owner comes home, because I often see his face poking out between the back door curtains to look for the dog as soon as he gets home. It's a stupid thing to note, but he always looks mad as hell when he does so, with his face all bunched up and his brow furrowed. I know enough about dogs to know that they shouldn't be hiding from their owner when they come home, and that they shouldn't be sitting outside no matter the weather. The poor thing looks like some kind of whippet or greyhound cross, and I can't imagine it handles the cold very well, and yet it just sits there like some sort of statue. I took some photos of it sitting outside in the rain through my window, but when I spoke to a friend of mine in law enforcement, they said it wasn't even obvious if there was a dog because of how blurry it all looked. That made me uncertain over whether I should call the police because I didn't know exactly what kind of proof I needed. Other than some strange behaviour and a general suspicion of neglect, I wasn't even sure how I'd describe the situation to the police. Looking back, I wish I hadn't let my doubt get the better of me. Since then, I've watched my neighbour slowly deteriorate. I've always suspected he was an alcoholic, but over the last 6 months, it's just gotten worse. What started with him shuffling home after work, arms laden with thick plastic bags and the odd bottle of vodka clutched in one hand, slowly escalated to him wandering home at random times in the middle of the day, clutching clear bags filled with booze. Whenever I greeted him, he seemed nice enough, but you could see this sort of growing exhaustion in his eyes. Over time, they grew bloodshot, and I noticed a tremor develop in his hands. It was obvious to me that he was an addict, and it wasn't long before the trash in his yard was joined with hundreds of smashed vodka bottles. It started out with the quality name brands, and slowly turned into a growing pile of smaller, cheaper spirits that he bought more frequently. Sometimes I'd wake up to the sounds of glass smashing and go outside to see him standing there in the light of his back door, the dog and man staring at one another with eerie intensity. I swear on my life, he was throwing glass bottles at the dog. But I can't say for sure, because I never actually saw it. One time, I heard my neighbour swearing, and I looked outside, only to see him clutching his bloody hand, threatening to beat or kill the animal. He'd say horrific things during these rants, and the dog would just be sitting there, looking at him blankly. He'd just keep going on about what that thing had taken from him, and how he can't go on keeping it happy, and how he'd already given it everything. Even though the dog couldn't understand a word being said, it went great lengths to show that my neighbour didn't love the dog at all. If anything, he hated it with a passion. On a hunch, I started asking around. I was told that my neighbour lost his child about a year back. It was heartbreaking to hear of how he'd found the dog on the roadside and brought it home with the hope of it becoming a family pet. It was just a few months later that his poor daughter went missing, and by the time the police finished their search, he was left a broken man. It was clear to me that he resents his dog. Perhaps he looks at it and sees the family he lost. I can't say I blame him for being so mixed up, but I also don't condone his actions. the poor dog hasn't done anything wrong. It's not like he was responsible for his family's death. Still, I felt very much like I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I only found the courage to do something when I woke up one night and looked outside to find my neighbour pointing a rifle at the dog. I immediately called the police and then sat and waited, my breath held. It was so tense, watching him standing there, finger on the trigger. But eventually he lowered the barrel and then stumbled back inside, sobbing so loudly I could hear it through my window. By the time the police arrived, sirens blaring with all the king's men in tow because I'd reported a firearm, the man was out of my view completely. The police kicked the door down and found him lying in a puddle of his own vomit. But it turned out he had a license for the shotgun, and despite the search of the premises, no one reported seeing a dog. This was even after I told them to check beneath the house, saying that just before they'd arrived, I'd seen the dog go scampering under there. Anyway, he had his gun stored correctly, and aside from a warning regarding ammunition, he was let off with something as simple as a fine, though the officer did tell me that the man's house was an absolute disgrace. Afterwards, my neighbour became a little cold to me. He never confronted me over the phone call, but he didn't seem very interested in being polite to me either, ignoring me completely or just grunting in my direction. I can't say for sure he knew it was me, but I think it would have been pretty obvious since only my house has a line of sight into his garden. After that, I started trying to get close to the dog to see what it was like. I'd wait until I saw my neighbour leave and then sneak out into my yard and call the little guy over. Poor thing. Whatever happened to him during his life must have been awful because his behaviour was very odd. He'd respond to my tuts and clicks and wander over to the fence, but he wasn't like a normal dog, neither wagging its tail, whining or barking. Whenever I peeked through a hole in the wooden planks, he'd just be sitting with those black eyes fixed on me, always knowing where I was. I must admit, it was quite unsettling, but I guess it was just a sign of how traumatized he must have been. He showed no outward signs of affection or interest, like he was numb to everything around him. When I went to put some food through one of the slats, he bolted forward towards my hand, and I got a bit scared and pulled back at the last minute, dropping the food on the floor. Strangely enough, he never ate the food I left, but I did see my neighbour come out that night and find the pile of kibble I'd left. He immediately stared up at my window and made eye contact and just shook his head. Then I watched as he picked it up and took it inside where he presumably threw it away. I was furious to think he was so spiteful he wouldn't even let me feed his dog. I never saw the poor thing eat. It looked all skin and bones. But here, this guy was refusing to even let that little sliver of kindness into that poor creature's life. That's why I knew I had to do something to help that dog. At first, I didn't know exactly what that would be. But a few days ago, I went for a walk and on my way spotted a small bag of rat poison sitting half empty on the open windowsill of his kitchen. Sure, I could have told myself that my neighbour had a rat problem, and he almost definitely did with all that trash around. But deep down, I knew he planned to poison that dog. He clearly hated it, blaming it for the loss of his daughter. So, I decided to wait until he left the next morning and take the chance. I hopped the fence as soon as I watched him leave, landing in his yard with a wet thud. Looking around, I saw the dog, sitting where it always did, turn to look at me with those glassy eyes. I walked up to it and went to pet it, but it instantly growled, its black gums and yellow teeth making for one ugly sight. I backed away and tried to figure out how to get the dog away from its home without touching it, and on a hunch, I tried the back door and found it open. Thankfully, while the dog refused to let me touch it, it came when called easily enough. I clicked my tongue, and it stood up and walked over, looking up at me with a strange sense of calm. I went into the house first, concerned that I might have gotten my neighbour's schedule wrong and that perhaps he was lying in wait for me. But there was nothing in that house except for the smell of urine, rotting food, and the waft of half-drunk alcohol and cigarettes. It made me retch just to go near it, and I practically ran through the home while calling the dog who followed me obediently the whole way. Afterwards, when I shut the door and stood outside catching my breath, I struggled to imagine what on earth could have made that place smell so bad. It made me certain that I was rescuing that poor dog from a life of disgusting negligence. I knew I couldn't keep the dog at my place, of course. It was the first place the neighbour would check, and he was a lot bigger than me. I'd taken the effort to call up a friend of mine who had a garage they could keep the dog in. It wouldn't exactly be the Hilton, but he'd have a bed, heating, and a safe place from emotional and physical abuse. It wasn't easy, but I managed to coax the little guy into my back seat, where I drove him to my friend's. The whole way, the dog's eyes fixed on me in the rearview mirror. It was a miserable, rainy night, and the passing streetlights lit the inside of the car with a strobing effect. I was so shocked and pumped full of adrenaline that sometimes I'd pass an overhead light and see the dog's face lit up. And just for a second, it had looked like something else. I can't say what exactly, but it gave me one hell of a fright. Just goes to show how unusual I find all of this. I actually started seeing things. Still, it wasn't a long drive, and before I knew it, I dropped the dog off with a friend, with a fair warning that it was a biter, and went back home, ready to confront my neighbour. I knew he'd eventually come back, see the dog missing, and come straight to me. And I waited all night with white-knuckle anxiety, only for him to never show. When morning came, I was getting ready to check on my friend when it all came crashing down and I just collapsed on my sofa and fell asleep. When I woke up, it was 7 in the evening and the sun was already setting. I had dozens of missed calls off my friend, and in a bit of a shell-shocked state, I got straight into my car and drove straight there. My neighbour must have followed me to my friend's house. He just might have. I turned up and banged on the door, but got no response. I kept knocking and calling him, trying him, his wife, and even the landline, but no one answered. In the end, I went straight into the garage, since the side door was open. Inside, I found the dog, sitting on the hood of my friend's car, with that same blank, passive stare on its face. For some reason, the look of it made me uneasy, and I decided to leave it where it was. I tried the door to his house, and thanked God that my friend was so lax on security, because it was open, letting me walk straight from the garage into his kitchen. Inside, I found the table set, meals laid out, ready for tea time. The children's coats were hanging on hooks, the TV was still playing Cartoon Network, and there were 2 unmade cups of tea by the kettle. I called out, looking for him, but found no sign of anything. I called the police, but they said there wasn't anything they could do, even after I pointed out that the family car was still in the garage. When I told him that I'd taken my neighbour's dog, they asked me if this was the same neighbour who didn't even have a dog, and then laughed. I could tell they were dismissing me, but I knew something was desperately wrong, and I'm still terrified that my neighbour did something horrible to my friend and his family. I took the dog with me, guiding him back to my car, and drove home to demand answers from my neighbour. Once again, no matter how hard I banged on the door, there was no response. I thought he may be hiding, or maybe still out. I couldn't see any sign he'd gone home since I'd first stolen that dog, but there was no guarantee of anything. So I hopped the fence, and this time went to his back door. Again, I banged furiously and shouted after him, but there was no reply, so I just went straight on in. By this point, I was furious and terrified in equal measures, but I immediately began ransacking his home for some kind of clues to what had happened. God, that place smelled awful. Before, when I rushed in, I'd missed all the signs of just how weird that guy was. I found his fridge full of odd frozen meats, couldn't tell if it was pork or chicken. And upstairs, I found a pile of human teeth sitting on the landing. There were dozens and dozens of them, way more than just one person's. His living room was uninhabitable, filled with trash, and it looked like he'd spent most of his time sitting in his study drawing the same weird pictures over and over. They looked like some kind of biology sketch, showing the same horrible monster, but from every conceivable angle. The creepy thing is that while I went nowhere near that room the first time I ran through that house, I must have glimpsed the drawings from afar, because they reminded me of what I'd seen driving to my friend's place. They were so horrible and weird, and so impactful, that my tired brain had actually hallucinated that monster sitting in my back seat. I still can't quite believe it, but I can't think of another explanation. But despite all of that, what really worried me was the pit. You see, in one room, a downstairs bedroom I think, there was what I can only describe as a kind of giant hole. It looked like some disgusting fluid the colour of oil and blood had been left to pool on the wooden floor. It had the consistency of bile and had somehow turned the wood into something with a texture of soft mud. Stepping onto it was dangerous because of how slippery it all was, but I got close enough to see that there was a 2-foot wide hole going straight down the middle of the floor. Down and down and down. It looked like a hole that led straight to hell. Looking around, in one corner of the room, I saw a pile of clothes that came waist high, and, nudging my foot through the sludge, I noticed fingernails lying amongst all the gunk. There was even a goddamn engagement ring lying just on the edge of that pit. Something about the way it lay close to 4 parallel gouges in the wood made me think of someone being dragged into that hole. Combined with the teeth, I suddenly realized that my neighbour must have been some kind of serial killer. He was probably disposing of the corpses straight down the hole. God, I thought, was that what was in those black bags all along? Had he been bringing bits of people home? I'd spent nearly a whole year watching him come and go at all sorts of strange intervals. Was this the explanation? All these questions, and way more, came flooding into my head. But chief amongst them was this. Had I ticked off a serial killer and led him straight to my friend's house? I phoned the police straight there and started babbling about all this crazy stuff. They must have thought that I was crazy, because they dismissed me with one seriously weak excuse. They told me that they'd found my neighbour, dead from suicide in a park nearby. He'd killed himself with rat poison, they said, and he'd been dead for over a day and a half. They went on to tell me that made me the last person to see him alive and that they'd want to speak to me. But I just felt numb just hearing those first few words. Since then, I've tried calling my friend over and over. I'm terrified that some psycho is out there trying to kill me, but nothing I've heard makes any sense. Is it possible he faked his death? I keep asking myself this over and over. Meanwhile, that dog just keeps sitting on my sofa, staring at me. It never barks or wags its tail, and I've yet to see it eat a damn thing. While I'm happy it's safe, I can't help but feel creeped out by it. My stomach is in knots just thinking about how I might have gotten my friend in trouble. Even weirder, just this morning I found a child's sock in a small pile on my kitchen floor. It's oily and smells just like the pit from my neighbour's house. It couldn't possibly be from my friend's daughter though, because I didn't take anything from that place, and it's not like the dog brought it. I would have seen it in its mouth. Now, all I can do is sit here and fumble over some of those strange notes I took from my neighbour's house. I keep hoping I'll find a clue, but all I see are horrible sketches of this disgusting monster and the same thing scrawled over and over and over. It's not a dog, 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 it's not a dog.